But first, as I said to you last night, I want to go back across a few things that I've picked up in recent days that strike me, well, as unusual to say the least. Inconsistencies in evidence at best, but at worst, well, let's just say the inquiries act as a whole lot of powerful laws to punish people who might have misled them in their evidence. If you believe the Premier's sworn evidence to the Coate inquiry, his evidence Friday 2 weeks back now, he said that he did not take up the Prime Minister's Office of ADF support to establish hotel quarantine in Victoria because he said he didn't believe coming out of that National Cabinet meeting that it was extensive, that somehow New South Wales would get more. That's despite the Defence Force Chief on the same day making exactly the same offer to Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria. Daniel Andrews said too in his sworn evidence that if he'd known about emails between his top bureaucrat Chris Eccles and the PM's top bureaucrat Phil Gaetjens on April 8, where Gaetjens tried to follow up Eccles and almost encouraged Victoria to do more with the PM's offer of ADF help, well, Daniel Andrews said if he had known about that email, he might have done things differently.
Given that it's so at odds with what I took away from the National Cabinet meeting, I think it would have been very significant to me. And I can't predict what outcome it might have had, but I certainly would have wanted to know.
That's his September evidence. So how does it square then with the Premier's own words 11 days earlier than that, when the National Cabinet decided to establish hotel quarantine 27th of March, and he himself said this.
We'll utilise private security. We'll also utilise members of Victoria Police, and I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister for his offer of support from the Australian Defence Force.
That was the 28th of March. His written press release on the 27th had that line, didn't it? It said it has also been agreed the Australian Defence Force will be engaged to support the implementation of these arrangements. Now, none of that squares with what the Premier told Coate in September. Well, at least it doesn't to me. But if he had have known, he says, well, he did know. He did know. That's why he didn't use the ADF, and it's critical. He did know the decision. But I'm interested now in who made that decision, when was it made, and why was it made? And why, of course, the memory loss. Well, more and more it's all starting to fall into place. And that with the inconsistencies in evidence, the backtracking on a whole lot of written statements to Coate, oral testimony that's starting to trip people up, you've got to say the confusion is growing. Back on the day of the National Cabinet decision, we know Friday, March 27, Eccles left the room at 12 o'clock. Before the meeting was over, he says, because it was urgent that he got the hotels booked to house the returning passengers from midnight the next day. He talks to the Premier's Chief of Staff and the Jobs Secretary, Simon Femister. Get it moving, he says, it's all urgent, and they swing into action. Well, Femister does at least, we know that, because he gets meetings underway at 12:30. And we know that these meetings discuss hotels, as Eccles said it would, but also they discuss security arrangements. Indeed, this is the first time we hear the word security used. And this we know because it's all in the meeting notes, and those meeting notes are in the Coate inquiry evidence. So we know about Femister, we know what he was up to, but what about the Chief of Staff? Well, she's never been called to give evidence. But in a crisis, let me tell you, Chiefs of Staff hardly sit still. By about 1:10, when National Cabinet then breaks up, within about a minute, Graham Ashton, the police chief, he's shooting off text messages, very concerned that police officers are going to do babysitting of hotel travellers. This is that infamous 6-minute window when he tells Coate he gets a call, but he can't remember who he spoke to. And Eccles first rules out speaking to Ashton in written evidence, but later in the stand he says, I can't recall. And finally resigns when his own phone records incriminate him. We also know that during this 6-minute window, at about 1:17, there's a private message from the Premier's office to the Premier's department discussing security. So straight away, police are out of the picture. Now, after Ashton has his chat to Eccles, he's back on the texts. He's sending them to his federal police counterpart in Canberra, basically saying, look, it's all sorted. Victoria Police won't be babysitting. AFP Chief Kershaw, well, he responds, Well, that's new. And when asked about this comment in Senate estimates this week, Kershaw's explanation was this.
My view was that the sort of agreed or the suggested way forward would be the use of police and ADF.
Up until that point, it was your understanding that Victoria Police would be used in guarding people who were returning from overseas? In
my mind, yes, but understanding that, it's a flexible, approach and it was their decision, not mine.
I mean, fair enough, Rhys Kershaw, because basically that's what every other state and territory did. Police, ADF, or both. It's only Victoria that substituted police for private security and rejected the ADF. Now, at 2 o'clock on this same day, there's a briefing. Crisp, the Emergency Management Commissioner, Ashton, the Police Chief, and the Police Minister, Lisa Neville. Of course, we can't call it a briefing anymore because Lisa Neville then said on oath a bit later on that Crisp never briefed her at any time on this day or the next day, even though we're in a state of emergency and massive decisions are being made. Now, in evidence, there's a few things here that grabbed my attention last night. The first, well, Crisp opens up the meeting. Crisp says, normally that's the state of play, he opens up the briefings, but on this occasion, Neville started the meeting. That was unusual, he says. And while on the teleconference with the Minister and Ashton, Crisp gets a text message from the official note taker out of National Cabinet. The note taker's doing the ring around to make sure everyone knows what's been decided. She says to Crisp, I want to update you about the ADF. Now, he's on the call with his minister, but he texts her back and says at 2:04 p.m, my minister has some idea of the ADF role. Now, really, does she? Because the official line we're told by the Premier and others is that this wasn't decided about the ADF until much later in the day at the State Control operational meeting at 4:30 p.m. So who spoke with Lisa Neville before 2 o'clock and gave her the heads up about the ADF? We know from her evidence to Coach she admits taking a call from the Premier's private office. And that's why she's now under pressure to provide the inquiry with further information about that call or calls after finally the inquiry started chasing the phone records. But who called her and what was said? Does Neville now say, as Ashton does, and who knew when about private security? What's all that about? You've got to question why Ashton goes through the farce of asking in this meeting if his officers will be used in hotel quarantine. I mean, this is 2 o'clock. We know at 1:30 he's already said he's told Canberra Victoria Police are out. Was this all about trying to get Crisp on the right page? You got to wonder. Now, remember what I said about chiefs of staff not twiddling their thumbs? Andrew's top staffer already knew what was decided out of National Cabinet way back at 12 noon, so she's had 2 hours to swing into action. Ministers like Lisa Neville inside the Premier's trusted circle, what does she know? What's she been told? Now, here's what I think. The decision not to use police and not to use the ADF, to go it alone with just private security, was a political decision made in the period between Eccles leaving the National Cabinet at 12 noon and this 2 o'clock meeting involving Neville, Crisp and Ashton. And I'm confident that I'm on the money, that this timeline sits about 12 to about 2 because Chris Eccles chairs a meeting of his departmental secretaries at 2 o'clock, and in this meeting he also refers to the use of private contractors. Now, all the departmental secretaries, they're all wholly owned subsidiaries of the Andrews government, given the public service was substantially restructured after the last election. Most of them too, at one time or another, have worked in a political office or were once deputies to Eccles. So to expect they would comply. But Andrew Crisp, he's not a secretary. He's a wild card in all of this because he has special obligations under law as Victoria's Emergency Management Commissioner. So they need to get him to back in this political decision, and they do. At around 4:30 p.m, Friday, 27th of March, Crisp chairs a meeting of what's called the State Coordinating Committee, the SCC, which was in fact the first official meeting of what later became known as Operation Satera. It's the operational players around the table, state and federal, and it's recorded. Now, in this meeting, it's interesting that when Crisp is still querying the use of private security over police, he gets a call. He leaves the meeting to speak with Graham Ashton. When he comes back to the meeting, well, it's very clear police will not be used. And when he's asking about the ADF a bit later on in this meeting, he gets another call. This time, it's all there on the recording. It's an urgent call, he says, from the Premier. Again, he leaves the meeting to take the call, and when he comes back, it's clear the ADF won't be used. Specifically, Crisp says, and this is the transcript, so at this stage, we don't see a need for boots on the ground, so to speak. Now, two things are important here. The first, this meeting in the SCC is just a box-ticking exercise. It's just all the public servants confirming a decision that the political operators had made hours and hours earlier. And two, there's clearly a mole in this group, because each time there's some concern that Crisp might go off the reservation and actually follow the National Cabinet decision to use police and the ADF, he gets a call. The first from Ashton and the second from the Premier direct. And private security out of this meeting is reaffirmed and the ADF is ruled out. Now, I don't know this, of course, I wasn't in the room, but if I was counsel assisting, this is precisely the sort of probing I'd want to do. And we also know now, don't we, that around this time, 5:30, 6:30 p.m. the same day, the feds are still chasing a reply from Victoria about the ADF. And this is where the Sutton Health Department emails rule out military support. Now, after all of this, for weeks and weeks and weeks, the Defence Force keep asking Victoria what they can do to help. And these messages, they're called sit-reps. They detail dozens and dozens of examples from March right through to May where the ADF offer Victoria more and more help, and the repeated response back from Victoria is, quote, Victoria Police have it under control. Well, we know 800 dead Victorians later, Victoria Police didn't have it under control, and in fact Victoria Police were nowhere near hotel quarantine. So why was Canberra told that VicPol had it sorted? Why was Victoria Police so opposed to the use of the ADF in Victoria? Well, there's something else that it's important you understand. Later on in June, after the disaster of the Black Lives Matter protests going ahead, when government ministers and officials already knew that the virus was leaking out of these hotel quarantine setups, Andrew Crisp, Emergency Management Commissioner again, well, he realised that something had to be done. He knew the difference between all the other states in Victoria was the use of the Defence Force and the police. Now, he couldn't bring the police in, he already knew where Ashton and Neville stood on that, but he could try and get the ADF involved, and that's precisely what he did. On Wednesday the 24th of June at 8:03 p.m, Andrew Crisp formally sought 850 Defence Force personnel to urgently come to Victoria to take over hotel quarantine and other tasks, ensuring infected people stayed at home, for instance, helping out with contact tracing, which we know by then was riddled with failure. In fact, it still is. When under an hour, lightning speed for these sort of big government-to-government requests, at 8:52 p.m, Crisp had confirmation from Canberra that the 850 troops were his. The very next morning, Thursday, June 25, here's the Defence Minister, Linda Reynolds, confirming that the ADF are on the way. She issues a media release, and then she announces it live on Neil Mitchell's Radio 3AW.
Look, last night we received a request from the Victorian Government in light, as you've said, of the state's increased confirmed COVID-19 cases. So we're looking to rapidly mobilise 1,000 ADF personnel to be on the job from tomorrow in support of Victoria. So we're looking at about 850 personnel providing planning advice and also hotel quarantine monitoring, and probably about another 200 to provide logistical and medical support for the public testing initiatives.
Now, another guest that almost immediately followed Senator Reynolds was a none too happy Police Chief, Graham Ashton.
You're comfortable with the Army coming in? Yeah, well, at this stage, they're not involved in any of the police side of things, so I think they're involved in the logistic planning. I think there's talk about the hotels and the security side of things.
Well, we're told they'll be going on some patrols with police.
We haven't been engaged on the police patrol side of things, so that would be news to me.
Are you comfortable with that sort of approach?
Well, I know Shane, as Shane similarly, would have a view that we've got that side of it covered, so I'm not sure if there were military assisting on patrols. I'm not sure what that would look like, but that's not something that's been discussed with us.
Now, after this interview, we know the Police Minister, Lisa Neville, shot off this text to Andrew Crisp, clearly angry the ADF were on their way to Victoria. And as Lisa Neville admitted in evidence to the Code inquiry, she was pretty cranky, sending off another message complaining about the ADF on its way. And we can only wonder tonight, of course, what would have been the result back in June if Lisa Neville hadn't intervened, if the ADF had arrived and done in Victoria what it did in every other state where Victoria might be tonight. Might be tonight in terms of lives and livelihoods. But clearly Lisa Neville won out here. Now, I'm told the Victorian Government didn't want to use the ADF because it would look like they had failed on hotel quarantine, that they didn't like the optics of the Morrison Government bailing them out. And even though Jenny Mikakos wanted the ADF support, like Andrew Crisp, she knew that hotel quarantine was going off the rails and sending Victoria into its second wave disaster. Well, Daniel Andrews, I'm told, rolled her, instead backing Lisa Neville. The next day, the Thursday, came this humiliating backdown. At 12:31 p.m, Andrew Crisp was forced to tell Canberra that Victoria's request for 850 troops was now withdrawn. Now, every Victorian who's lost someone they love has a right to the truth of what happened, what should have happened and why it happened. All the Victorians have lost their jobs and their businesses that have gone under. They deserve to know the truth too, as of every Australian taxpayer who'll be paying for the Victorian Government's incompetence for years. Not the half-truths of this underdone inquiry that's still not recalled one witness. Well, they're now onto the phone records, and that's good, and more paper in the way of affidavits. We saw that with the Brett Sutton example. This isn't getting to the truth if people are not put back in the witness stand. Just remember this very telling interview from Lisa Neville, again, Radio 3AW, from the 1st of July. Mistakes...
Was at any stage early, was it ever discussed the possibility of bringing in the Australian Defence Forces to run quarantine, as happened in New South Wales?
No. So
no?
The ADF have been part of our team right from the beginning, though, Neil. So they've been based with us in the State Control Centre, in the health teams, looking at planning, logistics, using their skills. That's where they are well placed, and we've now got their medical teams out there. So, look, I think we've picked using the ADF in the best possible way with the skills that they've got. We're very confident with what they're doing and with the new arrangements with the quarantine hotels.
That is a very, very telling interview, because we know between 12 and 2 o'clock on Friday the 27th of March, a decision was taken to go with private security and to reject the ADF. And Lisa Neville admits there, I don't think she even knew she was doing it, that was not a cabinet decision. It was a political decision, and I suspect we know the highest office in the state where that decision was made. Mistakes are one thing, incompetence worse. What gets them all in the end is the detail and the facts.